The Return, Chapter 15, Recovery. Eventually they had given Artem a desk. To be more exact, a seat, which was at a desk, if only to stop him taking up so much space in the centre of the office, and because no one had the courage and the energy to ask him to leave. He had filled his time by drawing compulsively, paper from the photocopier, a pencil taken straight from Tim's hand. Pictures of Saam, Saam sleeping, Saam perturbed, pensive, Saam looking over his shoulder, surprised and grinning. He was pouring out from his head all the sides of Samaran that he had seen, before the memories could fade. He did not know if he would ever see him again. He had wasted so much time on anger. "That's beautiful." The tearful blonde girl. "I didn't know you were an artist." She smiled a little. "You don't look." Then she saw his hostile face and fell silent. "You don't look like a child, but you cry like one." That stung. She tried to be brave, even though he really frightened her. "You put a lot of effort into being mean, but Saam likes you. People think he likes everyone, but he doesn't, not at all. But he does like you. So I'm going to try to ignore all your bullshit, because we both—" She would have said more, but Artem's eye roll and heavy sigh put her off. Even his sighing reminded any onlooker how physically huge he was. It was like having a bear in the office. Tim approached and put an arm around her to steer her back to her desk. "Come away from the nasty man, sweetie." Artem looked through narrowed eyes at Tim, whose dreams these days, when he could sleep, were full of anxiety and loss, and sex with Saam. And for the last 2 nights, sex with Artem. Once even sex with both of them at the same time. He was getting very little rest. Artem made small dog barking noises at him. Yup, yup, yup. How did Saam tolerate these people? His kidnappers had stopped posting. Did that mean he was dead? Then, after 2 endless days, finally, the news came that Saam was alive, that he had been lifted by the Hannath. There were unashamed whoops of joy, tears of relief, then questions. Why would they do that? Johnson said, "I have no idea. I just know he's alive." He was exhausted but elated. He hadn't been this happy since his first child was born. Where was he? There was an outcry when they learned that Saam was in the Hannath enclave and would not be returned to them at once. Outrage. Johnson tried to pacify them, though he wasn't happy himself. "Sally, I know, I understand, but we need to be realistic. We didn't find him. We didn't. They did." He was still brooding, quietly angry that the Nadiv had chosen not to help them. Not that they said so outright, of course. Leave it with them, they'd said. And then nothing. Perhaps they were still angry that the new vengeance painted them in such a negative light. Little better than the Kerahan, Tamar had said. If so, how was that Samaran's fault? And how did they disprove any of it by refusing to help? Contacting the Hannath Consul was an act of desperation, something his father would have called a Hail Mary, though Johnson had never really understood the term or the game. Saam was alive because the enemy took pity on him. One of them, at least. He looked at the project team. Without their help, he would have died before we got to him. Their medical facilities are as good as ours, probably better than anything we could provide. But they won't care about him the way we do, Sally protested. Artem put a hand across his face. He wished the woman would just shut the fuck up. "It was their rescue. I can't get into an argument with them over," Artem said softly, "over what's left of him." There was a shocked silence. Johnson said, Oliver is going to see him today. We'll hear from him this afternoon, okay?" Johnson took Artem aside and spoke to him. Would he stay for a few days? He wanted him to consider working more closely with them. His language skills. There were documents he could translate for them if he was willing. Artem shrugged. Okay. He could come in for a few hours each day, perhaps, and turned his attention to work that Saam, unable to read anything other than English, had never been able to do. It wasn't like he was planning to leave anyway, not before they had more information about Saam. If they wanted him gone, they would have to throw him out. Good luck with that. Matt started up a basic computer course for him. Fuck, these humans were so proud of these toys. It was almost funny. Still, it was something to do. Late that afternoon, Oliver's report back left them very unsatisfied. He said that Saam was badly injured as a result of prolonged physical abuse, and seriously ill after weeks of starvation, that they were caring for him, and that he was in the best place possible. No, he could not reassure them that Saam would recover, or even survive. There would be no visits, and that was it. His gloomy unwillingness to discuss it filled Johnson with sad foreboding. Carrying on with their work seemed suddenly pointless. Most of them took a few hours away to shower and sleep. Maggie encouraged them to take away with them the cardboard rubble, pizza boxes, drinks cartons that had accumulated while they searched for Saam. She opened a couple of windows, too, to allow the smell of stale fast food to dissipate. Roxy had tried to think about songs and storyboards, but what was the use? If Saam died, it would all turn to shit. She went home despondent. By far the worst news was for Otaku. The men who had held Saam were Japanese. They recorded their interactions with him and posted the videos for a fee-paying, super-rich clientele. The photos, it seemed, were merely adverts for the main course. They spoke only Japanese on the recordings. Oliver and Johnson asked Otaku to watch them and translate what was said. Obviously, any affiliations would be of paramount interest, but please, just capture it all of it. Otaku paled, nodded, said, "Hi." What else could he say? They set up a separate enclosed office for him to watch privately. The reports would take time. Each video was exactly 8 minutes long, 1 day a week for 3 weeks. Big men in Yakuza-style tattoos, though to Otaku's eye they didn't seem typically Japanese. Too big, too much body hair, often speaking over each other. He saw Saam forcibly stripped, thrown backwards and forward between 3 laughing men, his hands bound. His hair cut with his own knife. At least it was razor-sharp, a small mercy. His face slashed, and the comms device pinched out with bloody fingers, while they gripped the back of his neck as if he were a struggling cat. Drinking and mockery and derisive laughter. Beatings. Otaku saw Saam turn his face whenever he could, try to take the blows on the ear. Terribly painful, but better than smashing the bones of his face. He didn't always succeed. The 4th video was the first rape. Otaku howled, started throwing things. Not the computer equipment, of course, but everything else he could lift. He was yelling in Japanese and wailing. Sally tried to go to him, but was pushed roughly aside by Artem. "Get out of the fucking way, woman." He walked into the room and shut the door behind him. Artem grabbed Otaku's shoulders and shook him. Then he sighed and pulled the little man towards him as he would a child, held him, one big paw patting the back of his head as he cried. When he calmed a little, Artem released him. He wiped his face on his shirt sleeve and complained loudly in his own language. "Do you want me to help you?" "No, he would not want you to see this. You cannot see this. Summer and Son would not want—" He struggled to control his breathing, stopped the crying. "This is my—" He put one hand flat on his chest. This is mine." His cross to bear, Johnson's father would have said. Artem nodded and left him to it. "Artem-san." He turned, about to leave. "Eh?" Otaku gave that strange little head bob. "Thank you." Outside, Artem glowered at Sally, who flinched. That made him feel a little better. Then he went to what was now his desk. 8 more days passed before they heard from the Hannath. They had conceded. Against their better judgment, they would permit a visit. 2 or 3 people at most. Naturally, everyone wanted to be there. Johnson would decide, and it fell to him to turn down those who could not go. "Artem, I'm sorry, no. This is a Hannath enclave. Taking an Adiv there would be just asking for trouble. I'm sorry, but no." Johnson would go. Maggie, as Saam's direct superior, would also go. That was it. Otaku, who was standing with his back to the closed door of his office, as if he were trapping the hateful materials that were occupying his days, said, "Excuse me, I should also go. You may need an interpreter." He did not look as though he relished the opportunity. The Hannath enclave had once been an elegant country home. At one stage it was, for a while, converted to a college campus, before being finally abandoned. Much later it was acquired and taken out of mothballs for Hannath use. The main buildings were large and ornate, with some more modern additions, small guest houses, used for several years as teacher and student accommodation. The building that had once been a student library now served more or less the same purpose, except that many of the books were not written in any human language, and the aged and wickedly cantankerous librarian was in fact an Adiv, who must have had his own reasons for staying in the Hannath camp. Very few would have been brave enough to question him directly. Many of the outlying buildings were still boarded up, waiting to be needed, and for the funds that would permit their refurbishment, an issue that was a constant source of concern for the enclave consul, Lord Keriss. Those who knew of it referred to it as Little Hannath. Inside the high walls, beyond the heavily manned gate, the gardens were simply beautiful. Maggie looked around in admiration at some of the delicate roses they had managed to grow. They had expected to see Hannath, of course, and a few Karagath, but were surprised by the other races. Kerip, Xonak, wandering around peacefully about their business. Johnson asked the question, "Are these people slaves?" The beautiful young Hannath who had received them, who was busy escorting them to meet the consul, turned calmly and said, "That would be illegal, Agent Johnson." The young man's name was Tor. He smiled only a little when they tried to pronounce it, though it seemed perfectly simple to them. He was wearing expensive black trousers and a fine black T-shirt, all cut perfectly to fit him. Very much the way Keriss dressed. He was younger, of course, and his glossy black hair was cut short, about jaw-length. He had received Otaku with unfeigned delight. Johnson had opened his mouth to say, "This is Otaku," when he was interrupted. "Tanaka desu. My name is Tanaka Shigeru." Tor switched to Japanese, and they bowed and exchanged pleasantries. He had lived in Japan for a short while, he said. He assured Tanaka-san that he didn't judge the country by the final 3 weeks, when he and Saam had been made prisoners there together. Otaku opened his eyes wide, bowed, but made no comment. The consul's office was opulent and like stepping back in time to the Victorian age. You could shoot a costume drama in here, Maggie thought. The consul rose to greet them. Johnson had warned the others that they were tall, very tall. Keriss himself was a handsome and beautifully groomed man, approaching middle age, his strong build making Tor look like a youngster. Long glossy black hair was worn in a single heavy braid, with dark eyes and a slightly olive skin. Tor was pale by comparison, though spending 3 weeks in an Osaka cellar might have had something to do with that. Keriss seemed polite and courteous, taciturn, possibly a little weary. He smiled tightly as Tor introduced them, Agents Johnson and Rousseau, and Tanaka-san. His slight nod told Johnson that he remembered him from the hospital. They were here to see Saam. More nodding. Maggie, flushed with embarrassment, produced a wrapped, very red apple from the pocket of her coat and tried to hand it to the consul. "Maggie," said Johnson. Tor rescued her from the appalling gaffe of trying to touch the consul and took the apple from her. "It's beautiful," he said, smiling kindly. She said staunchly, "It's from my garden. Sally made me promise to tell you how much he liked apples. Likes apples. I can't go back and tell her I didn't try." The two Hannath smiled politely. He was a cherub. Of course he would like apples. Keriss finally spoke. He said, a little surprised, "You are Maggie?" He flicked the tiniest side glance at Tor. "Blink and you would miss it." "I am." Johnson was suddenly aware of a strange feeling of familiarity. The facial gestures, the eyelash flickers, the looking through lashes. Some of his mannerisms were similar to Saam's. Tor offered, "Saam is still delirious, but he sometimes speaks. He cries out. He has mentioned your name more than once." As if he were calling for his mother, Maggie realized. Calling for help. Calling for her. She shivered, put a hand to her mouth, and forced herself to be steely cold. The younger Hannath reassured her. "It is nothing to be concerned about. The drugs will take time to leave his system. We thought he was calling on a lover." He smiled at her again, then caught the look of dismissal given them by Keriss, a slow blink of the eyes like a cat. Keriss said something softly in Hannath as he returned to his seat, which Otaku later told them meant, "The place has become a circus, and he isn't even awake yet." Otaku waited outside while they went in to see Saam. "You will not need an interpreter in there, and he would not want me to see." He looked at Tor. "I will see him again." His face was blue-white. It was a tough question to ask. Tor was quite cheerful. "Oh, yes, this part is grim, but he'll recover completely." Well, that wasn't perhaps entirely true. It was impossible to tell just how far he would recover his mental health. We know how to deal with this. He looked at Maggie and Johnson. "I would ask you not to speak. To be clear, you are seeing him against medical advice. He would not want you to see this, but I understand that you need to satisfy yourselves that he is being well cared for. I just ask that you be silent. Ideally, he won't know you're there. We've kept him almost unconscious for over a week while we worked on his face. I say we. My Lord Keriss brought in specialists from the other enclaves to repair some of the broken bones. He was quite a mess. You can consider yourself lucky that you were spared that. We are only now allowing him to come back to full consciousness, gradually." He added, "Oh, he lost a lot of body weight in Osaka. He has recovered a little while he has been here, but he is still very gaunt. There is a Carib woman in the bed with him. She is there to keep him warm." He gave them another of his easy smiles. All perfectly normal in a Hannath household. Then he ushered them into the room. It was a well-appointed bedroom with one wall entirely made of windows. Warm light from the garden flooded that end, and Saam was in a large bed with an assortment of covers. He was indeed gaunt, and his beautiful hair was shockingly short, but clean. And he was out of his mind. At the slight sound of their entrance, he started fretting like a child, then struggling, yelling and crying, almost screaming. Without the slightest sign of confusion or embarrassment, the dumpy middle-aged carrot woman beside him in the bed put her arms around him, gently stroked his hair and face, talked to him softly, comforted him as if he were a child having a bad dream. He settled down again in a few moments and fell asleep in her arms. They were in there barely a minute. Maggie came out feeling as if she might faint. That woman, is she a Carib? I'm not sure Saam even speaks the language, but it is the tone that is important. I mean, is she a slave? That would be illegal, Agent Rousseau. She has a black eye. Samran's dreams are bad. He meant no harm. She was not badly hurt. I treated her myself, and she took no offense by it. She's a sensible woman, and kind, just what he needs right now. They were parting when Tor saw the way Otaku was looking at him, in recognition. He stopped and bowed his head a little to talk to the much smaller man. Have they been making you watch the videos? Otaku nodded. Me too. Awful, aren't they? Have you finished them all yet? Otaku shook his head. I saw the one where He pointed to the man's hair. You were very brave. Tor said nothing. He was doing his best to overlook the break in protocol. Otaku had openly acknowledged his shorn hair. An old acquaintance would have noticed a slight flush to his face, but this human did not yet know him well enough to see it. He moved on smoothly, saying to Maggie and Johnson, If he can recover, he'll recover here. You can take comfort in that. I know what you've seen is awful, but it's a mistake to take it too seriously. It's perfectly normal. He probably won't remember any of this. Maggie said, You were a medic? The young man shrugged, apparently happy enough to chat to them. He seemed as gregarious as Keriss was reserved. Well, I was in training. Then my father sent me here to fetch my brother, whom I couldn't find, failed to find, and now I can't go back. And Consul Lord Keriss has taken me in and given me something to do. They didn't ask why he couldn't go back. Perhaps his failure to find his brother. Otaku would explain later, because his hair has been cut. He is shamed. He cannot go back until his hair is long enough to braid. Tor looked at them, at their deeply distressed faces. You saved my life, you know. They were puzzled. They didn't know. We were locked up together in a filthy cellar, often too dark to see very much of anything, which was probably a good thing. Apparently these people, they take someone, one of us, make 1 or 2 videos, take a few photos, and then post them online. People make offers, bids to see them, to watch them. Well, to watch them beat you to death, over a period of days. Humans, he thought wryly. My picture was already published, the bidding had started, and then Saam arrived, and they decided to use him instead. The bids for him were so very much higher. He lasted far longer than anyone they'd ever... You will hear them talk about it in the later videos, he said to Otaku. They admired him for it. By lasting so long, he gave me a chance to find a way out. And of course he gave me his food. He laughed. They looked shocked. His idea, he needed the water far more than I did, and he couldn't digest the fish. He smiled at Otaku. I may never eat fish again. And then you left him behind, said Maggie, cold, trying to imagine the utter despair Saam must have felt. She was only a little gratified when Tor coloured. Johnson intervened. "You were the one who took his collar information to Keriss." "Consul Lord Keriss, yes." His correction of the older man was very gentle. "You saved his life." "Well, the consul did that." "Why? Why did he help?" "It seemed only fair. He had performed a service. More than one. He was there to rescue me. By mistake, but still. Then he took my place. And then he gave me time to get away. And of course the consul has some responsibility for... He inherited... I should say he owns that collar." They stared at him. By Hannath law, he was saying, Keriss owned Saam. Johnson and Maggie looked at each other in silence. Was this a new problem? Just how easy would it be to get Saam away from here when he recovered? If he ever did. To Otaku, Tor said, "I believe we'll meet again, perhaps work together. I'm glad to have met you, Tanaka-san." Bowed and shook his hand. He hesitated before saying, "Their tapes are awful to watch, I know. I don't envy you having to watch the rest. I tried to focus on him rather than them. He's very brave. He doesn't cry out. And he doesn't beg. The only time I heard him speak, someone had given him a sip of wine, and he thanked him. Lovely manners." He laughed. "At one point they're doing their best to be menacing, threatening him, telling him what they're going to do to him, and he literally laughs in their faces. He told me later in the cellar, he said that the beatings they gave him, truly awful, were nothing compared to the beatings the Nadiv handed out on the Vengeance. I confess I was shocked by that. I was expecting him to say that his owners... Not entirely sure that it was true. A touch of bravado, perhaps. Anyway, he was a lot braver than I would have been, I'm sure. At the end, he gives up a little. He resigns himself to it. He's waiting to die. But he is patient, dignified. Is that the right word? I admired him, so I focused on that." Keriss joined them to give them farewell. A Keragath boy, blue-eyed, yellow-haired, and shining with bucolic health, came around the corner with an armful of fresh flowers and stopped, looking at them, unsure. Keriss saw Johnson's surprised look of recognition. The stinking, screaming boy from the hospital. That cat blink again and a slight smile. "I needed a new gardener." "What happened to the old one?" "He got old. He needs help." The two Hannath turned to look at the boy with the flowers. He froze, embarrassed, not knowing where to look, muttered something incomprehensible to the humans, even to Otaku, who knew no Keragath. The two Hannath smiled and nodded in a condescending, aristocratic fashion, and allowed the boy to take the flowers to the sick room. He left as fast as his legs would take him, tripping over his own feet as he made his exit. Flowers for Saam. Johnson recalled the soother Saam had given the Keragath boy in the hospital. He smiled a little. Samaran, he thought, could make friends in hell.